The first word was alone, not spoken, gestured, a modified sign from American Sign Language, adapted for hands twice the size of human ones, with fingers that moved with unexpected delicacy across the space between us. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable, and carried a weight that stopped my breath. We'd been working together for 4 months. 4 months of careful approach, patient repetition, building trust across a divide I'd spent my career believing was absolute. 4 months of treating this as a research project, a scientific inquiry into the cognitive boundaries of non-human primates. And then, in a single gesture, everything I understood about intelligence, consciousness, and isolation shattered. My name is Dr. David Winters. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, or I was before I learned something human civilization wasn't ready to know. For 8 years, I studied language acquisition in great apes, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans. I taught them signs, watched them combine symbols, documented their capacity for abstract thought. I believed I understood the upper limits of non-human communication. I was wrong about everything. The research station sat 40 miles into the Olympic wilderness, accessible only by helicopter or a 3-day hike through terrain that discouraged casual visitors. I should never have taught him to speak. I should never have learned what he had to say. The project began as something else entirely. Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist I'd worked with at Stanford, contacted me in May 2017 with an unusual proposition. She'd been consulting with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on a classified assessment of unidentified primate behavior in the Olympic Peninsula. Vocalizations had been recorded, structures had been found, tissue samples had been collected and analyzed, showing DNA that didn't match any known species. They want to know if it's intelligent, Sarah said over an encrypted video call. Not just smart like a chimp, actually intelligent, self-aware, capable of abstract reasoning. And they think I can determine that how? By doing what you do, attempt communication. If it's capable of symbolic thought, language acquisition, intentional teaching, that tells us something critical about what we're dealing with. The ethical implications were immediately obvious. You're asking me to treat an unknown species as a research subject without consent, without understanding what we're dealing with, without any framework for, David, they're going to study it regardless. The question is whether someone with actual expertise in cognitive science and ethics is involved, or whether it gets handed to people who see it purely as a national security problem. She sent me the genetic analysis. Hominid, definitely hominid. Divergent from human lineage by roughly 1 million years, but sharing cognitive development genes, neural plasticity markers, and most critically, FOXP2 variants associated with language capability. I accepted the position in June. The research station had been constructed specifically for this project, a reinforced observation facility built around a natural clearing in old-growth forest, one-way observation glass, audio recording equipment, video monitoring, and at the center a large outdoor enclosure. Though calling it that felt wrong. It was more like a provisioned territory, 2 acres of natural forest, a stream, shelter structures, but surrounded by barriers designed to contain something strong and potentially dangerous. The subject had been captured 3 weeks before my arrival. Captured was the word in the official reports, though the methodology suggested something closer to prolonged sedation and transport. A young male, estimated age between 15 and 20 based on dental analysis and skeletal development. Height, approximately 7 feet, 2 inches. Weight, 430 pounds. Examination showed no signs of disease, malnutrition, or previous injury. He'd been unconscious for the capture and transport. When he woke in the enclosure, the video footage showed panic, not the thrashing of an animal, but something more controlled and more frightening. He'd tested every section of the barrier systematically, looking for weaknesses. When he found none, he'd retreated to the farthest corner and remained motionless for 16 hours. The first time I saw him in person, through the observation glass, I felt something I hadn't expected: shame. He sat near the stream, shoulders hunched, staring at nothing. His posture communicated something universal across primate species: defeat, grief, the understanding that something fundamental had been taken and wouldn't be returned. We need to establish non-threatening presence, I said to Dr. Martinez, the project veterinarian. This isn't research, this is trauma response. Your job is to assess cognitive capability, Dr. Winters, not to anthropomorphize. I'm not anthropomorphizing. I'm observing clear behavioral indicators of distress in a highly intelligent primate. Then help us understand how intelligent. That's why you're here. I began the next morning with the simplest possible approach. Presence without demand. I sat in the observation area where he could see me, did nothing threatening, and waited. The protocol from great ape research: let them come to you. Let them determine the pace of interaction, never force contact. He ignored me for 6 days. On the 7th day, he moved closer, not approaching, just repositioning himself where he could watch me more directly. His eyes were remarkable, dark brown, deeply set, with an expressiveness that seemed to look through the glass and assess not just what I was, but who I was. I held up my hands and signed, "Friend." He stared for a long moment, then deliberately turned away. But he'd understood. I was certain of it. Progress came slowly, measured in small gestures and incremental trust. I established a routine. Arrive at dawn, sit in the same location, perform simple signs repeatedly. Good morning, food, water, safe, basic vocabulary, drawn from American Sign Language but simplified for larger hands and different anatomy. I never pointed cameras directly at him, never brought additional observers, never did anything that suggested threat or exploitation. For 3 weeks he watched without responding. Then one morning in late July, he approached the glass. Not close. He maintained about 10 feet of distance, but it was intentional engagement. He sat, mirroring my posture, and watched my hands as I signed. I went through the basic vocabulary, speaking the words aloud as I signed them, creating audio-visual associations. When I signed water, he glanced at the stream. When I signed food, his eyes tracked to the provisioning area where we left fruit, nuts, and vegetables. He understood. The question was whether he could or would reciprocate. I introduced new signs. Yes and no. Simple head movements that corresponded to nearly universal primate gestures for affirmation and negation. I demonstrated by asking obvious questions. Is this water? Pointing to the stream, signing yes. Is this water? Pointing to a rock, signing no. On the 4th day of this training, I signed a question. Are you hungry? He looked at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded. Yes. My hands were shaking as I documented the interaction. This wasn't mimicry or conditioned response. This was understanding, processing, and intentional communication. Dr. Martinez watched the video footage with an expression I couldn't read. Could be coincidence. Could be he's learned that nodding results in food delivery. His timing was too precise. He waited until after the question was complete, processed it, then responded. That's linguistic comprehension. One interaction isn't enough for conclusions. So I continued. Questions with obvious answers, then gradually more complex. Do you want fruit? Do you want to go outside the shelter? Are you tired? He answered consistently, appropriately, demonstrating clear understanding of interrogative structure. By August, we'd established a vocabulary of 30 signs. Basic nouns, simple verbs, affirmative and negative. He could request food, water, and privacy. He could answer questions about his immediate environment and needs, but he initiated nothing. Never asked questions. Never volunteered information beyond direct responses. It was functional communication, but limited, like talking to someone who understood your language, but had no interest in conversation. I tried to expand his engagement. I brought objects, a ball, a puzzle box, simple tools to see if he'd ask about them or attempt to use them. He examined them with clear curiosity but returned them without comment. He's communicating at roughly the level of a 3-year-old child, I reported to the Project Oversight Committee in early September. Receptive language is strong. Productive language is emerging but limited. He understands symbolic representation and can engage in simple exchange, but shows no evidence of spontaneous language generation or abstract reasoning. It was a lie. I'd already seen evidence of much more sophisticated cognition. The way he'd organized his living space, not randomly but with clear purpose and aesthetic consideration, the structures he built from branches, which showed planning and architectural thinking, the way he watched the birds and seemed to distinguish individual species by behavior rather than just appearance. But I needed time. Time to build more trust, to develop more communication, to understand what we were dealing with before the military contractors decided they had enough data and moved to the next phase of whatever this project actually was. In late September, I introduced abstract concepts, emotions. I started with happy and sad, signing them while showing pictures of human faces displaying those emotions. Then angry, then afraid. He watched with an intensity that suggested more than academic interest. When I signed afraid and showed him the corresponding image, he looked away. Then he signed back, yes, not answering a question, making a statement. He was afraid. October brought the breakthrough I'd been working toward, and the beginning of my understanding of what I'd actually done. I'd been introducing more complex grammatical structures, possessives, past tense, spatial relationships. My food, your water, yesterday, tomorrow, the building blocks of temporal and abstract reasoning. He absorbed them quickly, far faster than any great ape I'd worked with. His productive vocabulary had grown to over 100 signs. He could construct simple sentences. Want food now. Water cold. Bird loud morning. But still, he initiated nothing beyond basic requests. I decided to try something different. I brought photographs. Images of the forest, of mountains, of the ocean. I wanted to see if he could recognize places, if he had memory of a world beyond the enclosure. The first photos generated mild interest. Trees, rivers, clearings. He looked at them briefly and returned them. Then I showed him an image of a coastline, the Pacific Ocean meeting rocky shore taken somewhere along the Olympic Peninsula. His reaction was immediate and visceral. He reached toward the photo, touched the glass between us, and made a sound I'd never heard before. Low, resonant, almost mournful. Then he signed, home, far, alone. 3 words, 3 abstract concepts strung together into something that wasn't just communication. It was expression, emotion, loss. I sat motionless, the photograph still in my hand, understanding for the first time what I'd been too professionally focused to see. He wasn't a research subject demonstrating language capability. He was a person, stolen from his life, imprisoned in a place he didn't understand, communicating with a captor he'd learned to tolerate because he had no other choice. I'm sorry, I signed. Not a phrase I'd taught him, not part of our established vocabulary, but I signed it anyway. He watched my hands, tilting his head slightly. A gesture I'd learned meant he was processing something new. Then he did something that changed everything. He pointed at himself, then signed, name? A question. His first spontaneous question, not about food or water or immediate needs, about identity, about the concept of self as something distinct enough to require a label. I'd been calling him the subject in reports, the individual in conversations, avoiding naming because naming felt like claiming ownership over something that should never have been owned. But he was asking, requesting the dignity of identification. I don't know your name, I signed. What should I call you? He stared at me for a long moment. Then he made a gesture, not a sign I'd taught, but something that seemed to come from his own language, his own system of communication, a complex movement, hand to chest, then outward, with fingers that curved and separated like branches. I tried to replicate it, failed, tried again. My hands couldn't quite match the movement. Human fingers don't bend the same way. He watched my clumsy attempts, and for the first time since his capture, I saw something that might have been amusement. Then he simplified the gesture, modifying it into something my hands could manage. I repeated it successfully. He nodded, then signed, yes, me. I'll call you that. I signed back. Then, impulsively, my name is David. I fingerspelled it, a technique I'd introduced weeks earlier for words without signs. He watched carefully, then replicated it, D-A-V-I-D. Then he signed, David. Why alone? I didn't understand at first. I'm not alone. There are other people here, other researchers. No. He signed it emphatically, then pointed at me, then at himself. Same. Alone. Why? And suddenly I understood what he was asking. Why was I like him, separated from my people? Why was I spending every day in isolation, communicating with someone from a different species, living in this strange place far from wherever I belonged? He thought we were the same, both prisoners, both alone. I chose to be here, I signed, though the words felt hollow even as I formed them. His response was immediate. Why choose alone? I had no answer. After that conversation, everything changed, not in the way the project administrators wanted. He didn't suddenly become more compliant or more productive in demonstrating cognitive capabilities. Instead, he became more insistent. He asked questions constantly. Where is my family? I didn't know how to answer. The capture reports indicated he'd been taken from a territorial range that showed evidence of multiple individuals, but whether they were family, social group, or something else entirely, no one had bothered to document. I don't know, I signed honestly. Find them. Not a request. A demand. I'm not allowed to leave here. You prisoner too? No, what was I? I'm here to work. Work is teach me human words. Yes. Why? It was the question I'd been avoiding since accepting this position. Why were we teaching him to communicate? What was the actual purpose of demonstrating linguistic capability in a captured subject we had no intention of releasing? To understand you, I signed. To know if you think like humans. I think. He signed it with clear frustration. I think before you. I think after you. You come, I still think. He was right. The arrogance of assuming that linguistic capability somehow proved cognition, rather than just providing access to cognition that already existed, was stunning in its anthropocentrism. I started documenting our conversations more carefully, but also more selectively. The official reports emphasized vocabulary acquisition, grammatical structure, and response time, quantifiable data that satisfied the oversight committee. But I kept separate notes encrypted and stored offsite about what he actually said. He told me about memory, fragmented and limited by vocabulary but clear enough. He remembered forest, family. He used a sign that meant same smell group, territories that were seasonal. He remembered learning from others, being taught which plants were food, which were medicine, which were poison. He had culture, transmitted knowledge, social learning. How many of you are there? I signed one morning in November. He looked at me for a long moment, then signed, Why you ask? I want to understand. You want to catch more. His signing was becoming more sophisticated, incorporating emotion through movement intensity and facial expression. This was signed with clear suspicion. No, I promise. I just want to know about your people. Why you take me. I didn't take you. I came after. But you stay. You teach me. You help them keep me. He was right. I was complicit. No matter how much I told myself I was there to ensure ethical treatment, to document his capabilities, to serve as an advocate, I was still part of the system that held him prisoner. If I could release you, I would. I signed. You lie. You have hands. You open doors. You have freedom. You choose to keep me. That night I couldn't sleep. I reviewed the security protocols, the monitoring systems, the barriers that kept him contained. They were sophisticated but not impenetrable. With the right access codes, the right timing, the right distraction, release would be theoretically possible. But release to what? He'd been in captivity for 5 months. His territory had likely been claimed by others. His family group, if they'd even tried to find him, had probably moved on. Releasing him might just mean a slower death, starvation, exposure, territorial violence from others who no longer recognized him. Or maybe that was just another rationalization, another way of justifying inaction. I contacted Sarah Chen through secure channels. What's the end game here? When do we have enough data? What happens to him after? Her response came 12 hours later. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. I asked anyway, filed formal inquiries through the project administration. What were the plans for long-term containment? What were the criteria for project completion? Were there any provisions for eventual release? The answers were vague, bureaucratic, and terrifying in their implications. Subject disposition will be determined based on security considerations and scientific value. Disposition, not release, not rehabilitation. Disposition, like he was equipment, a resource to be managed and eventually disposed of. In December, he stopped eating. Not suddenly. It was a gradual withdrawal, smaller portions consumed, food left untouched, weight loss that became medically concerning within 2 weeks. Dr. Martinez wanted to intervene, forced feeding, nutritional supplementation, medical management of what she called failure to thrive. He's choosing this, I said. He's aware of what he's doing. Then your job is to convince him to stop. Use your communication. Make him understand he's harming himself. I sat with him that afternoon. He looked thinner, more drawn. The vitality that had been slowly returning over months of communication was fading. You need to eat, I signed. Why? His signing was slower, less energetic. Because you'll die. I know. The simple clarity of it was devastating. Please don't do this. Why? What I have here. He gestured around the enclosure. No family, no home, no freedom. Just cage and human who teach words. Words for what? So I can say I want freedom in way you understand? I say it, I want freedom, now what changes? I'm trying to help you. Then open door. I can't. You choose not. He turned away from me, the conversation clearly over. I reported the interaction to the Oversight Committee. Their response was predictable. Increase monitoring, prepare medical intervention, consider psychiatric consultation. Psychiatric consultation? I stared at the screen. You want to medicate him for depression that's a completely rational response to imprisonment? We need the subject healthy enough to complete the research, Dr. Chen said. Your personal feelings about the ethics are noted but not relevant to project success. That night I made a decision. I returned to the facility after hours using access codes that technically weren't authorized for solo night work. The observation area was empty, surveillance systems set to passive recording rather than active monitoring. He was awake, sitting by the stream, staring at the water. I activated the audio system, a risk, but necessary. Can you hear me? He looked up at the speaker, then at the observation glass. Nodded. I need to tell you something. About why you're here. About what they're planning. I told him everything. About the genetic research, the studies of his cognitive capability, the military interest in understanding whether his species represented a security concern or a resource opportunity, about the fact that there were others, his kind, being tracked, monitored, and possibly targeted for capture. About the fact that he would never be released because releasing him meant losing an unprecedented research subject and potentially compromising classified knowledge of his species' existence. When I finished, the silence stretched for a long time, then he signed, You tell me this why? Because you deserve to know the truth. Truth changes nothing. I still in cage. They still hunt my family. I'm going to try to stop them, to expose what's happening here. But I need your help. I need you to demonstrate clearly, unmistakably, that you're not just intelligent, that you're a person, someone who deserves rights, protection, legal status. What is person? He signed. Human word. Human idea. You ask me to prove I am human enough to deserve what humans deserve. But humans are ones who take me, who cage me, who hurt my family. Why I want to be person like humans. It was the most sophisticated philosophical argument I'd ever witnessed from a non-human intelligence, and it destroyed every framework I'd built my career around. What do you want? I signed. Tell me what you actually want, and I'll try to help you get it. His response was immediate. Want you to understand what you did. I didn't capture you, I've been trying to help. No, understand. You teach me your words. Now I think in your words. Before, I think in my way, my people's way. Now when I remember home, I remember with word home. When I feel sad, I feel it with word sad. You change how I think. You make me more human in my head. Even if I go home, I not same. You put human inside me. I felt something cold spread through my chest. That what you did, he signed. You teach me to speak. Now I speak. Now I know what I lost because I have words for losing. Before, I just feel. Now I understand. Understanding is worse. I submitted my resignation the next morning. The Oversight Committee denied it. You're under contract for the duration of the project. Early termination requires cause and approval, neither of which you have. Then I'm refusing to continue communication training. That would constitute breach of contract and violation of security protocols. You'd face legal action, potential criminal charges, and loss of all professional credentials. I was trapped in the same cage I'd helped build, but I could still document, still collect evidence, still prepare for the moment when exposure became possible. I started recording everything, not just our communication sessions, but his behaviors when he thought he wasn't being watched, the way he built small structures from branches, creating patterns that suggested aesthetic preference rather than just functionality, the way he organized his living space with clear intentionality, the way he watched birds and seemed to distinguish individual personalities, not just species. Most importantly, I recorded our conversations, the questions he asked, the concepts he grasped, the philosophical and ethical reasoning he demonstrated. In January, he spoke his first English word. I'd been teaching him vocalization alongside signing, not expecting success since his vocal anatomy was different from humans, but wanting to give him maximum communication options. We'd been working on simple sounds, vowels, basic consonants. He'd been practicing, I realized, at night when he thought no one was listening. working on it alone, with the same determination he showed in everything else. The word was David, not signed, spoken aloud, in a voice deeper than human but unmistakably forming the syllables of my name. I stood at the observation glass, unable to move, as he continued. David, listen. The articulation wasn't perfect. His vocal structure created resonances and overtones that made the words sound almost like they were coming from a different dimension, but they were clear, intentional, human language, spoken by someone who was supposed to be incapable of human speech. I'm listening, I said aloud. You teach many words. Each word came slowly, carefully formed. Now, I teach you. Teach me what? He gestured around the enclosure, at the trees and stream and sky visible beyond the barriers. Then he made a series of vocalizations, not English, not words I'd taught him, but something else. Deep modulated sounds that carried meaning in their tones and rhythms rather than in discrete phonemes. My words, he said in English, then continued in his own language, a flowing sequence of sounds that rose and fell like music, like poetry, like something that had existed long before human language, and would continue long after. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly. I don't understand, I admitted. I know, but you hear? He tapped his chest. You hear me, real me, not human words, my words. I was recording, all of it. The first documented example of complex language from an unknown hominid species. Not learned but original. His language, his people's language. The recording would be worth everything, career, reputation, freedom, if it could prove what he was, who he was. But when I reviewed the footage that night, I saw something I'd missed in the moment. His expression as he spoke his own language. Not pride or satisfaction at demonstrating capability. Grief. He was speaking his language to me because there was no one else left to speak it to. He was teaching me because he knew, with the same certainty he knew he'd never be released, that he might be the last one to speak these words, that his language, his culture, his people's entire way of thinking and being might die with him in this facility, and I had made him conscious enough of that loss to articulate it. The next morning I contacted every journalist, activist organization, and human rights group I could find, sent encrypted files, provided coordinates, explained what was happening at the facility. By afternoon, security had detained me. By evening, the story was already spreading online. The legal proceedings took 8 months. I was charged with theft of classified information, breach of contract, violation of security protocols, and a dozen other federal crimes that together carried potential sentences of 30 years. The government argued I'd endangered national security, compromised sensitive research, and violated the trust placed in me as a cleared researcher. My defense was simple. I'd exposed human rights violations against a sentient being. The trial became a referendum on one question: was he a person? The government's expert witnesses argued for highly intelligent primate, but not person. They emphasized the legal definition of personhood, the distinction between intelligence and rights-bearing status, the precedent that would be set by granting legal standing to non-human entities. My witnesses, primatologists, linguists, philosophers, ethicists, argued that personhood wasn't about species membership, but about capability, self-awareness, linguistic reasoning, moral understanding, future planning, all of which he'd demonstrated. The judge ultimately ruled against us. However sympathetic the defendant's concerns may be, the law does not currently recognize non-human entities as persons regardless of cognitive capability. The appropriate venue for such recognition is Congress, not this court. I was sentenced to 5 years, suspended to 18 months with supervised release, contingent on continued non-disclosure of classified information. The subject, they never called him by the name gesture I'd been using, never acknowledged his own linguistic self-identification, was moved to an undisclosed facility. All research was reclassified under deeper security protocols. The public controversy faded within 6 months, lost in the noise of newer scandals and more immediate crises. But something had changed. Congress held hearings on rights frameworks for non-human intelligence. 3 separate bills were introduced, attempting to define legal personhood in ways that could include sophisticated non-human cognition. Bioethics committees issued new guidelines for research involving species with demonstrated linguistic capability. None of it passed. None of it became law. But the conversation had started. I was released after 14 months for good behavior. Returned to a world where I was unemployable in academia, toxic to research institutions, and known primarily as that scientist who thinks Bigfoot deserves human rights. Sarah Chen contacted me once, through intermediaries. He's still alive, still in containment. They've expanded the research to include other subjects, juveniles mostly, building a breeding population for long-term study. He's teaching them to sign, teaching them English, creating a generation that will grow up bilingual, bicultural, capable of communicating with both their own kind and with us. Is he? I couldn't finish the question. He asks about you, signs your name sometimes. They think it's interesting. Evidence of social bonding across species lines, attachment formation with human handlers. They're documenting it as part of the cognitive capability research. I wanted to ask if he was happy, but the question was obscene. How could he be happy? He was a prisoner creating more prisoners, teaching them the tools of their captors, ensuring his people's captivity would be more sophisticated and more permanent. I'd taught him to speak so we could understand each other. Instead, I'd given him the words to understand his own imprisonment, to articulate his loss, to be conscious, in human terms, of everything that had been taken. That was the horrifying truth I'd discovered. Language wasn't a gift. It was a colonization. I hadn't elevated him to human understanding. I'd infected him with human ways of thinking, human frameworks for suffering, human consciousness of captivity. I'd made him more alone than he'd been in silence. I live in a small town in Montana now, teaching English at a community college to students who've never heard of me or my trial. It's quiet work, honest work. I teach them grammar, composition, critical thinking, the same tools I once taught to someone who never asked for them. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what he's doing, whether he still speaks English or has retreated into his own language, whether he's teaching the juveniles both languages or trying to preserve their original way of thinking, whether he hates me for what I did or understands that I was trying, however clumsily, to help. I received a package 6 months ago. No return address, delivered through channels I couldn't trace. Inside, a single photograph. It showed him in what looked like a larger facility, still contained, but more space, more naturalistic environment. He wasn't alone. There were others visible in the background, including what appeared to be juveniles. And in the foreground, clear and unmistakable, a structure built from branches, organized in patterns that suggested communication, written patterns, symbols. They were developing writing. A post-it note was attached to the photo, handwritten in script I didn't recognize. He wanted you to know. They're learning to speak to each other, in their own words. I don't know who sent it. Sarah, maybe. Or someone else in the program who thought I deserved to know that something had survived my intervention. That despite everything, despite the captivity and the forced bilingualism and the loss of freedom, they were creating something new, a synthesis. A way to preserve their own language while learning ours. A way to be themselves while existing in our world. Or maybe it was a crueler message. Look what you started. Look at the culture you're destroying by giving them access to ours. I think about that first word he spoke. Alone. He was right. We were both alone, separated from our own kind by choices we didn't fully understand, communicating across a divide that language could bridge but never eliminate. I'd thought I was teaching him, but he'd been teaching me all along, that intelligence isn't defined by language, that consciousness doesn't require human validation, that personhood exists whether or not we recognize it. The most horrifying truth wasn't that he could speak, it was that he shouldn't have needed to. His existence, his consciousness, his right to freedom, none of it should have required demonstration through human linguistic frameworks. The fact that we needed him to prove his personhood by performing humanity was the real horror. I carry that knowledge now, like a weight that can't be set down. Every time I teach someone to write, to express themselves, to find their voice, I remember that voice can be both liberation and cage, that the tools we use to express ourselves are also the tools that shape what we can express. That language isn't neutral. It carries culture, perspective, ways of thinking that aren't universal. He understood that before I did. That's what he was trying to tell me when he spoke in his own language. Not, this is what I can do, but this is what you're erasing. I'll never know if he forgave me. I'll never know if the juveniles growing up bilingual will curse my name or thank me for giving them tools to navigate the human world they've been forced into. All I know is this. Some truths are too heavy to speak, and sometimes The greatest violence we can commit is teaching someone to articulate their own oppression.